and then a 15-minute freeway discussion, and then looks like it's an hour and 5 minutes for questions, but we can be a little flexible with all that. There's a lot of time for questions, so if you need a little bit longer, I think, in your little presentation.
It's not as if I had a written text.
Okay. So welcome back from our break, and now we will have two respondents to George Ellis's fascinating paper, and then an open discussion. Okay, so let me introduce both of the respondents together right now. We'll have first John Hare, my colleague John Hare, who's the Noah Porter Professor of Philosophical Theology here at Yale, and he's written a number of books, including The Moral Gap, and why bother to be moral? That's always a good question. I'm going to find out. So he'll be speaking first, followed by Peter Van Inwagen, who's the John Cardinal Hare Professor of Philosophy at Notre Dame University, who's written some very influential books in metaphysics and philosophical theology, including Material Beings, and a great book called Metaphysics, which has been very useful for for many years now for a lot of students learning metaphysics for the first time. Anyway, so John will speak first, and then Peter will speak, and then we'll have a panel discussion.
Good. In making a comment at this conference, I'm stepping outside my usual area of thinking and writing. And I didn't know what George and Michael were going to say, so I've written about something else, but which connects at various points. I'm teaching this semester a course on Aristotle's Metaphysics, Book 12, a book that attempts to show that there is at least one eternal, unmovable substance. The Greeks, and in particular Plato and Aristotle, have been one of the most significant sources within all three of the Abrahamic faiths for reflection on the question of this conference, and I'm not going to apologize for returning to the mother lode. I will not try to give you a reading of the argument of the whole book, but I want to focus on the use Aristotle makes of final causation during the course of his argument. And I wanted to do this because I was worried that final causation would get lost and that we would focus our attention inordinately on efficient causation. Sometimes the history of thought is presented as though the great triumph of modern science was the elimination of final causation. But final causation has re-emerged in the philosophy of biology and in metaphysics more broadly. One of my co-panelists, Peter Van Inwagen, has been important in this re-emergence, and I, for one, have profited greatly from his work in this area. George Ellis also has emphasized purposive causation, so perhaps I shouldn't have worried. At any rate, I'm going to start with some remarks about Aristotle and his use of final causation in Metaphysics 12, and then I will say something briefly about the reception of this argument in one of the Abrahamic faiths that I know about, namely Christianity. Aristotle starts the book, "Substance is the subject of our inquiry. For the principles and the causes we are seeking are those of substances. For if the universe is of the nature of a whole, substance is its first part. And if it coheres by virtue of succession, on this view also substance is first." It was primarily Speusippus who argued for the second of these alternatives, that the universe coheres by succession. Speusippus took the view that what is primary is number and not value. And one question I have for George Ellis is how he's going to tie his Platonic view of mathematics to his account of kenosis. Speusippus was Plato's nephew, who took over the academy when Plato died, when Aristotle was the other possible candidate. Aristotle then founded his own institution in competition, and there is, I judge, a certain edge to his criticism of Speusippus that we do not find in his criticism of anybody else. The book also ends with Speusippus, and those who say mathematical number is first and go on to generate one kind of substance after another and give different principles for each, make the substance of the universe just a series of episodes. And here he's using his term for a bad tragedy that has no narrative unity, just a series of episodes. And he goes on, and they give us many principles, but the world must not be governed badly. And he ends the book with a quotation from Homer. "The rule of many is not good. Let there be one ruler." In this quote, he's picking up his own metaphor at the beginning of the final chapter. We must consider also in which of two ways the nature of the universe contains the good or the highest good, whether as something separate and by itself, or as the order of the parts. Probably in both ways, as an army does. For the good is found both in the order and in the leader, and more in the latter, for he does not depend on the order, but it depends on him. And all things are ordered together somehow, but not all alike, even fishes and fowls and plants. And the world is not such that one thing has nothing to do with another, but they are connected, for all are ordered together to one end. The basic metaphysical picture here is spelled out in brief form in the first chapters of the book, and at greater length earlier in the metaphysics. We start with substance, because we are concerned with how to divide up the world into things, and with what happens to those things. In principle, there is an infinite number of ways to do this, but with most of them we get mere heaps. With a heap of sand, there's no good answer to the question whether it's the same heap when the breeze blows away a grain or 2 grains. What we need is a principle of unity that keeps a thing together, both synchronically and diachronically, both at a time and through time. Aristotle gives in the logical works an account synchronically, and in the physical works diachronically, and then he ties the accounts together. Here is a statement by a contemporary biologist which can serve as a summary of the result of this tying together. I quote, "The essence of a living thing is that it consists of atoms of the ordinary chemical elements we've listed, caught up into the living system and made part of it for a while. The living activity takes them up and organizes them in its characteristic way. The life of a human being consists essentially in the activity imposed upon that stuff." Here Aristotle's chemistry and physics are jettisoned, his account of earth, air, fire, and water, and their natural motions. But the biology remains viable, except to the extent that Aristotle considers and rejects a version of the theory of evolution. Substance, he thinks, is primarily biological, and the form provides a principle of unity which allows for the matter to be different at one time and another, and the form controls the development of the organism through its various stages to maturity. We don't need, Aristotle insists, Platonic forms for this kind of biology, though we might need them for mathematics, since the form is always already immanent. But we do need something to explain the continuity of this form, and this takes us to a moving cause of the universe as a whole. The substance lines, for example, the succession of human beings, are dependent upon the universe as a whole being in a certain way. Aristotle explains this both in terms of efficient causation and final causation, and it's the latter I want to stress. The universe as a whole needs the same kind of principle of unity as the individual substance, or it will be, as Aristotle thinks it is for Speusippus, itself merely a heap. The prime mover provides such a principle of unity because of the prime mover's goodness. Aristotle says famously that the god produces motion by being loved. When we ask Aristotle for the details of how the god does this, the answer is regrettably sparse and spotty. Most of what he does in Metaphysics 12 is negative theology, showing why we cannot say the various things about goodness in the universe that his predecessors and contemporaries say. Especially, we cannot say what Speusippus says, who denies goodness to his fundamental principle. I suppose Aristotle thinks we should glean his positive views from how he rejects the alternatives. He gives us clues in various places, which are not altogether helpful for our contemporary recovery of his overall picture. For example, the heavens rotate in circular motion because it's the most perfect motion, and so most closely imitates the actuality of the unmoved mover. I don't want to try defending any of these views, but what underlies these hints is a more general strategy. The good is seen as what draws us to the God. This is a difference in emphasis from Plato, for whom goodness is a static resemblance or participation. For Aristotle, the goodness is dynamic. It is in the change, rather than just in some state towards which the change tends. This is true even in some of the things Aristotle says about our human likeness to the divine, where he is at his most Platonic. He says, any way of living which either through excess or defect hinders the service and contemplation of God is bad. The contemplative part of this may involve simply thought about God and perhaps the essences of things. But the service of God seems to involve change and choice of natural goods. So now something very briefly about the reception of Aristotle's argument within Christianity. There's one signal difference, applying to many theologians in all three of the Abrahamic faiths, that God is seen more like the demiurge of Plato's Timaeus, as initiating the cosmos, and initiating time by initiating the cosmos, rather than by sustaining what is already eternally there. Unlike the demiurge, God is also seen as bringing the cosmos to an end. But with that difference, much of Aristotle's structure is repeated by, for example, the scholastics. To take Scotus as one case, since God is the best, the most perfect conceivable, necessarily God is to be loved. And since God is to be loved, the love of God is to be loved, and so the movement towards God. This is seen both in terms of efficient and final causation, which we can put in Christian terms by distinguishing between alpha and omega, where omega, the last letter of the Greek alphabet, is the end not merely chronologically but teleologically. If we take what I called Aristotle's strategy, the suggestion that the good is what draws us towards the God, then we can think of the course of the universe, informed by the good, as directed towards godlikeness, rather than towards, for example, decay and exhaustion. There are all sorts of metaphysical possibilities here, none of which require Aristotle's own rejection of evolution. George Ellis's talk of emergence is one such possibility, though I do not pretend to be competent to evaluate it, and I'm slightly skeptical about notions of emergence. Whether it is, as he says, not properly scientific, seems to me largely a matter of the definition of science, and I'm skeptical about whether there is any non-question-begging way to define science so as to exclude it. But one way to take the question of the conference is, why should there be any thing? And to take this as requiring an ontology, an account of what things there are. If what there is primarily is substance, and if substance requires form, we should take seriously Aristotle's argument that immanent form requires the transcendent good as its principle of persistence. Thank you.
Oh, so you are. So I'll use the timer function in my phone here to try to keep within this. There we go. 15-minute limit. Unlike John, I actually did prepare remarks on two papers I hadn't heard before, sitting up there in the back on my computer. Can I see it here now? And I will, okay. Mostly to what I want to say to both talks is just yay and amen. Most of the stuff, though, that I have to, that I could say anything useful about is not about the parts to which I would say yay and amen, but I'd like to say something about, first, I want to talk just about one strand that I see that's common, that was common to both the talks, that wasn't really part of the central message either. And before I do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the question of we're asking when we're asking why there's anything at all. Now, like George, I'm a confirmed Platonist, and and like any Platonist, I'm going to distinguish between, as you might say, Platonic and non-Platonic things. So the non-Platonic things would be all this that we see around us, and God, if there is a God, and Cartesian egos, if there are Cartesian egos, and anything, in fact, that can enter into causal relations, that can act on something or be acted on something. If you like Greek, we could call them etiological objects. And I take it the question whether there's anything at all is for those of us who are Platonists and think there are things that aren't like all these things, that I suppose those of us who think that there are such things as, I don't know, real numbers and the operation of multiplication and functions of a complex variable and so on, to mention just the mathematical ones, we think they are not capable of entering into causal relations. Nothing can act on them, and they can't act on anything. They just sort of sit there being the measures and descriptors of things. Well, they have their own reality as well, but that's their relation to the physical world. So the question, obviously, why is there anything at all, doesn't refer to those things. It refers to the things, such things as there are that aren't those things, the things that can enter into causal relations. The question, why is there something, is why is, as I see it, is the question why there is something causal, why there is something that can enter into causal relations. What my own subject, metaphysics, had to say about this, I think if you go through everything and you put it all together and you boil it down, you get something like this. There's two arguments. One of them purports to show, I don't claim it does show, but anyway, what it purports to show is if you just assume that it's possible for there to be something, you can deduce by with strict, rigorous logic from that the conclusion that it's impossible for there to be nothing. Not bad, to deduce if you could actually do it. Another kind of argument would attempt to show that, well, maybe it's not impossible for there to be nothing, but it's extremely improbable. In fact, about as improbable as anything can get, since of all the ways things could be, only one of them is there be, at most one, is there being nothing. Maybe if it is possible, still there can't be two completely empty ways reality could be. There has to be only one, and obviously there's some very high infinite cardinal measures the number of ways things could be. So by however you want to assign a probability measure on this, by any reasonable assignment, you're going to get it to be a probability zero of there being nothing, and that's about as improbable as something can get. It's the same probability that an impossibility has, but it isn't, in fact, an impossibility. It's, they say, the probability that you will get a certain infinite sequence of zeros and ones if you tossed a coin forever, which is not impossible, provided it's possible to toss a coin forever, or if you had an ideal dartboard with a mathematically sharp dart, if there were such thing, you threw it at the board, it would be the probability of your hitting any one particular point in the board. Well, I'm not going to present those arguments. I just remark it seems to me that that's all, and everything metaphysics has had to say about the question boils down to some contribution to one or the other of those arguments. What I want to talk about that's related to the two papers is all the stuff that's in the vicinity of scientific claims by physicists or cosmologists to have somehow explained how nothing can turn into something, or quantum tunneling is through from nothingness into something or something like that. And I was glad to hear both people who seem to know what they're talking about in this area say pretty much what I've said as an ignorant outsider looking in on this, that, well, really, I mean, if you have this state of the universe that represents nothing, what is it that's in that state? I mean, the state just exists as a mathematical abstraction unless it's the state of something. So what are we talking about here? And in George's paper, he claimed that that's more like what Michael Heller had to say. In George's paper, he talked about this approach presupposing that the laws pre-exist the universe, or if you like to say that there wouldn't be any time if there wasn't a universe, so there's no pre. At any rate, you can say the laws could exist even if there were no universe. They suppose that. And I wonder what that would mean. Now, in a sense, as Platonists, if we think what is a law from a Platonist point of view? Well, I suppose a law is a certain proposition. That is, you can imagine one lecture in physics. Let's suppose, just grant me for the sake of argument that the English sentence, in every closed sentence, in every closed system, angular momentum is conserved, expresses a law of nature. If you don't like that, pick some other English sentence of your own to serve as an example of something. So one lecturer speaking that says that, and then another speaker, another lecturer speaking in another language, German say, says something that it, says the same thing in that language, and then one in Coptic and one in Chinese. So obviously what they're saying is not a linguistic entity. What they're asserting is not a linguistic entity. It's something that exists independently of any particular language, at least. We Platonists say these things exist independently of all languages. A radical Platonist like myself would say they would exist no matter what. We call these things propositions. That's just a word. Though what they are is things that people say, people assert, that can be true or false. They're objects of belief or acceptance. And I would say that that's what a law of nature is. The proposition that in every closed system angular momentum is conserved is a law of nature. So like a Platonist like myself is going to say that this law would exist no matter what. Still, I want to raise this, and of course, since the law must be either true or false, it will be either true or false. I'd be inclined to think that that one would be true, no matter what. Although if there were no universe at all, it would be what logicians call vacuously true. You know, the way it's true that every unicorn is a kangaroo. Well, no counterexamples, right? There aren't any unicorns that aren't kangaroos, so logicians count that one as true because they want to count everything as either true or false. So every proposition is either true or false. Fine, and we'll go along with that. In that case, that would be true, but would it be a law? That is, just because something is a law of nature, if a law of nature really is a proposition, and I suppose, since laws, I would be inclined to think that every law of nature is true. That is, if anyone asserts a law of nature, what he says is true. And I don't see how something could be true if it wasn't a proposition. If somebody says in every closed system, system momentum is conserved, and that could be true. I suppose it is true. I would suppose this would still be true, but it wouldn't. I don't see how it would be a law. I forget who now it was. Somebody asked, if there were nothing, what would the laws be written on? Well, it seems to me that for this proposition to have the status of a law, there would have to be some kind of physical reality to confer that status on it. It doesn't get to be a law intrinsically to itself, the way a number gets to be odd intrinsically to itself, or indeed the proposition say that all bachelors are unmarried is maybe the truth of that is intrinsic to itself. But I do not see how lawhood could be intrinsic to a proposition. Now, obviously, I do not see is not an argument. It just all I'm saying is if I look at this contention that there might be imagine that there's an empty world. Well, we Platonists say that there are still all these propositions, all the ones that actually are around. They have truth values. Some of them are the truth values they have in the actual world. Some of them are different. There are dogs is true in the actual world. It won't be true in that world where there's no universe. I think in every closed system, momentum will be is true both in the actual world and in the empty universe, but for different reasons. Right? In the actual world, because there are all these closed systems, and in every one of them, momentum is conserved, and in that world, just because there are, as in the actual world, no counterexamples to it, because there are no systems at all, and therefore no closed ones. So there aren't any closed systems in which momentum is not conserved in that world, just as in the actual world. But that's a trivial kind of truth. It's not true because somehow physical reality forces some kind of status on it. So I would put it this way. If it's really true that those who attempt to explain why there is something instead of nothing in physical terms do presuppose that if there were nothing, there would still be physical laws, so that they can go ahead and then say what the consequences of there being those physical laws would be. It's very hard, at least for me to understand, maybe someone can explain this to me, what confers the status of lawhood upon these propositions, which I'll concede as a Platonist exist. And of course, if my Platonism is wrong and the propositions don't so much as exist, then the problem is even worse. If George's description is right of what is presupposed, then the situation is even worse. My main point is to say, if you're a Platonist, that doesn't help, because the Platonist will say the proposition will still exist, but it can't just of its own nature have the status of law. Okay, was there anything else? I think I'll just ask just one question about something in George's paper that puzzled me a little bit, and maybe I'd like to hear a little bit more about in the discussion. And this is the statement that if there's only one universe, how can we make probability statements about it? And I would say, well, we might have some idea about equal probable states of that universe. It wouldn't be a good argument, I think, to say if there was just one, suppose there was just one pair of dice. Somebody had just invented dice, and there's this pair on the table. I think we could give perfectly good answers to the question, what's the probable, we know, say, that let's say they're perfectly machined cubes and that they are really, their density is uniform and everything. Yeah, how many ways, what are the chances in 10 throws of throwing a double six twice? Yeah, we could answer that question, even though there's only one pair of dice and they've never been thrown. And what makes that possible is that we have some idea of a partition of states of equal probability of the future of that dice. If there were such a thing for the one universe, I'm not saying there is, but if there is such a thing for the one universe, then I guess we could make probability statements about it. So that's just a question for discussion. I think I've used just under 14 minutes, and I will stop there. Thank you.
We now have time for the panelists to discuss. Maybe we can begin with George responding, and then there'll be further discussion among the three.
Okay, I want to respond to three things. Firstly, the question, what's the relation of the Platonic view of mathematics to the kenosis thing? The key thing about the mathematics is we are convinced that if we were to meet astronomers from Alpha Centauri or Andromeda or elsewhere, they would know that the square root of 2 is irrational, that Pythagoras' theorem, which is why these have been suggested as the basis for communication with these beings if we ever meet them. I am convinced that if we were to meet those beings, that the, let's call them spiritually aware people out there, would also understand the power of kenosis, that they would also know that this is an extraordinary kind of moral behavior which has a transforming power which cannot be achieved in any other way. So it's exactly the same. I think it's universal because I believe that it would be discovered by morally aware beings anywhere in the universe. Okay. Incidentally, just one comment on this. What I'm putting forward, of course, is a view of a moral realism. And I know that's highly controversial, but that's my position. What I think is very amusing is that Richard Dawkins believes in moral realism. Now, the reason I know that is because Richard Dawkins has written at great length about how he knows it is a fact that Christianity is evil. Okay. Now, you could argue about that fact, but the point is he believes he knows standards of good and evil by which he can judge if Christianity is good or evil. And he believes those standards are incontrovertible. What that means is Richard Dawkins, without realizing it, I think, actually believes in a moral realism, just the way I do. The second point was the Platonic things. What you said was they can't enter into causal relationships, but they can through the human mind. This is really very important. The world of mathematics is comprehended by the human mind not by physical experiment but by a logical thought process. And we all know that the process of mathematical discovery is totally different from the process of discovery of physical laws. But through that process, we can discover mathematical things which then have consequences in the real world. For instance, they underlie engineering, they underlie physics. For instance, the Mandelbrot set is an example, a favorite example. The Mandelbrot set, in some sense, has been sitting there in a Platonic space waiting for 14 billion years until we had computers powerful enough to print them out and discover them, because you can't discover the Mandelbrot set until you have computers powerful enough to do the calculations. But nobody imagined the Mandelbrot set would be anything like it was until it was discovered. But then it was printed on paper. When it's printed on paper, that abstract thing has resulted in this physical realization. So they can have causal influences through the human mind. Another very interesting example is the laws of physics. Maxwell's equations, for instance. Not only do Maxwell's equations govern the lights in this room and the way we see, but Maxwell's equations were discovered by Maxwell. Maxwell's equations, as discovered by Maxwell, are a human representation of the entity, the laws of physics. Maxwell's equations, the human thing, written out in some formalism, tensorial or three-dimensional, whatever, then resulted in the discovery of the idea of electromagnetic radiation, the idea, therefore, that as well as light there must be radio waves, and therefore in the existence of radios, transistors, telephones, cell phones, you name it. So Maxwell's theory, through its influence on Maxwell's mind, and then on the minds of other people, has resulted in the existence of all of that technology on the earth today. So Platonic things are causally effective in that way. Okay, sorry, let me just explain. My philosophy about ontology is as following. I believe that, as I've said, physical stuff exists. I believe we can say that anything exists if it can be proven to have causal effects on the physical stuff that exists. That's my philosophy of ontology. And the final point was, oh yes, if there's only one universe. If you had a die and you throw the one die, you can give a probability. The problem with the universe is the die was only thrown once. What is the meaning of probabilities if the thing is only thrown once? There isn't anything you can compare it. But in order to state the probabilities, so you can say, if it had been thrown, I can work out what the probabilities would have been because I know the laws. We do not know what the laws are. We can conjecture what those laws are. We cannot test those laws. There's no way we can test any laws you might like to suggest for creation of universes, because you'd have to look at an ensemble of universes to see that those are the correct laws. So you'd have to know the laws in order to predict what it would have been, in order to give you a chance of what happened in a single one. There isn't any way we can know what those laws are. We can't test them. And so in that sense, it's extremely difficult to make any sensible statement about laws of creation of the universe.
Could we just respond to those? So what I had in mind in asking the question was whether you think that these value realities are themselves involved in the physical beginning. Now, I can see that you argue that you can't have kenotic behavior unless you have some kind of stable physical structure. So that the physical structure is necessary, as it were, instrumentally. But what I was inviting you to think about was the views of somebody like Nicholas of Cusa, or somebody who thinks that the beginning of a physical universe is itself a self-limiting of the intelligence that does it.
Of the intelligence that does it.
Yes, so that it doesn't have to be God, but whatever it is, that there is something kenotic in the physical initiation itself.
there's something kenotic if you take this view in the sense of a creator who creates such a universe then pulls back in order to let it run its own life, respects its integrity. Yeah. And it's that respect of the integrity, standing back and letting it happen, even if what happens is not what you would have liked to see happening, which of course relates to the problem of evil. So I would see the kenotic thing there in being, you create the possibilities, and then you stand back in order to let the thing have its own integral existence. I don't know if that answers it.
Well, you've certainly hit on the primary argument that should be used against the view that Platonic objects are without causal powers. This is an argument that has worried me for a long time, or essentially the argument you stated. One very striking example they might use here is, here's a statement by Gödel. Speaking of the axioms of set theory, and particularly of the power set axiom, that for every set that exists, the set of all its subsets exist, he said, that statement forces itself upon the mind as true. So, are we to imagine that, I mean, let's suppose for the sake of argument that Gödel is a purely material object made of up quarks and down quarks and electrons and so on. Are we to imagine that in addition to all those photons and gluons that are transmitting forces, there are forces that are due to the power set axiom that are acting on Gödel's brain? Or do we want to say something more like this? Well, yeah, there is an explanation, a causal explanation of Gödel's coming to the conclusion that the power set axiom is true. And we would, at least on one level of explanation, we who can't trace every elementary particle that makes up his brain, we would mention the power set axiom and the fact that he was thinking about it in the course of giving that causal narrative of how he got to that conclusion. Nevertheless, we don't want to say that the power set axiom acted on any of the matter in his brain in the way in which other particles of matter in his brain acted on them. But this is a very difficult question in the philosophy of mind, and indeed it's led some philosophers to say we couldn't, if there were abstract objects, we couldn't possibly have any knowledge of them because you can only have knowledge of things that act on you. I regard this as a counterexample to that thesis, but the argument could go either way. As to the dice, well, look, I mean, suppose you're a bookie and the dice, there's just one set of dice that's been made. It's sitting on the table. It's never been thrown. It's about to be thrown 10 times. There's going to be a big ceremony.
It's only going to be thrown once.
All right, once. Yeah. I meant one 10 times in a row. There's going to be but if you wanted the sequence of throws to be just one, just that the probability examples are a little more impressive in the case of 10 throws than they are in the case of one. So suppose that it's just one die then, all right, and we're going to throw it once. You're a bookie. Somebody comes to you and says, I want to bet that it will fall 4. What odds will you give me? I know exactly what odds I would be willing to give him or to post to attract people's bets away from other bookies. Any odds under 1 in 6. Right? And why is that? Because I think there's a 1 chance in 6 that die is going to fall 4. And how do I know that? Well, not by having observed because rightly or wrongly, I regard the space of possible throws of the die partitioned into 6 exactly equal states, and I think I deduced that from the nature of the die itself.
Yeah, and we have no way of stating what the partition of the space of possible universes
that is. But notice that argument is not the same as there's only one universe. It's that the universe is so complicated that we can't partition its states the way we can partition the states of a die.
Let's open up for questions from the audience. A suggestion was made before that when you ask a question, perhaps you can give your name and just state what your field is so people can get a sense of what the opposing sides are in these debates. So let's start with Joel.
Joel Primack, I'm an astrophysicist. I wanted to actually make two comments. One was really a response to John Hare's question about kenosis and the origin of the universe. And that has to do with the Jewish concept of tzimtzum.
Yeah.
This is medieval Jewish mysticism.
Yeah.
And the idea is that God withdraws from the universe to allow creation. And indeed, this idea of God withdrawing is also God contracting to fit into the Holy of Holies in the original temple in Jerusalem. The connection with kenosis that I first saw was made in Jürgen Moltmann's, I think it was his Gifford lectures, where he discusses it in some detail and tries to explain why this is somewhat analogous to the Christian notion of kenosis. But I wanted to respond critically to only one thing that George Ellis said, all of which, aside from this, I found extremely appealing and very much along the lines of my views as a practicing cosmologist. And that was this idea that morality somehow has to be built into the nature of the universe in order for it to come into existence as we understand it. And I just want to give the now fairly standard modern alternative possibility that it arises out of human interactions of the sort that are included in evolutionary descriptions. But evolutionary descriptions including not just Origin of Species, but Darwin's other great book on evolution, namely The Descent of Man and Sexual Selection, and the more modern view, especially propounded by David Sloan Wilson, of group selection. The idea being that it's not merely survival in the sense of the survival of the fittest, defined by fitting well into a niche, but that the very rapid evolution of the human brain, a factor of 4 increase in volume in something of the order of 1 million years, is very similar to other extremely rapid, from the point of view of evolution, developments, such as the selection of bird plumage, which usually is thought to occur by female birds choosing, for example, male peacocks. This is discussed in some detail in the chapter The Peacock's Tale in Dawkins' book, The Ancestor's Tale. T-A-L-E, Ancestor's Tale, T-A-I-L, Peacock's Tale. So the idea is that sexual selection, that human male and female select each other for their entertainment value, which includes intelligence and lots of other things. And the fact that male and female humans are sexually not very dimorphic, unlike peahens versus peacocks, suggests that the selection goes both ways. And then there's the group selection aspect, which I'll go into, but I'm assuming that people are fairly familiar with that idea. In any case, there's a fairly detailed narrative within the context of this sort of sociobiology of how most aspects of human morality, including their more or less universal nature, can easily be explained. So I particularly was puzzled by your desiring to bring morality in at the beginning when you so eloquently explained the idea of emergence, that the proper way of understanding reductionism is not radical reductionism, but merely consistency, that the higher levels of explanation arise naturally in some complex way, and they merely have to be consistent with the lower levels of explanation. That is, chemistry must be consistent with physics, but there are laws of chemistry that we do not know how to deduce and may never know how to deduce from physics, let alone laws of biology and psychology and group psychology and so forth. So why not use the same sort of reasoning with morality? There must be something else going on. It requires such an intelligent person as you, George, to make an exception for morality.
So you want morality to emerge. My view is that it's the understanding of morality that emerges. It's very, very different to say it's the understanding of morality. Mathematics doesn't emerge, it's the understanding of mathematics that emerges. It's not morality that emerges, it's our understanding of morality that emerges. That's my parallel in it. And of course I'm aware of all of these sociobiology work on this. And there's a couple of points about this. The fact that we evolved to behave in certain ways is not, in my view, the same as saying it is right to behave in those ways. I think there's an absolutely crucial distinction about that. The problem with the sociobiology story of the origin of morality is, in my view, it can explain what I would call shallow morality, but not deep morality, because the standard view of kin selection is it's fine to, you will sacrifice on behalf of your kin in order that their genes will survive. That means it's fine to kill the enemy, okay? In fact, it's a morality which supports war, your group against the other group. And I do not believe that that is deep morality. So I think it's a very, very dangerous view to say that evolutionary theory is an adequate basis for morality. Evolutionary theory tells you how people tend to behave, which is quite different from saying that this is how they ought to behave. In fact, our understanding of morality has transformed in the last 200 years, actually. We could go to a whole discussion about this. So anyhow, the distinction I'm making is exactly the same as mathematics. What has obviously changed is our understanding of mathematics. Our understanding of physics has changed. Our understanding of morality has changed. The mathematics has been unchanged. The physics has been unchanged. In my view, the morality has been unchanged.
Barry.
Barry Lower from the philosopher. I want to follow up on Peter's.
Microphone.
So I'm Barry Lower. I'm a philosopher. I want to follow up something that Peter was asking George, because although I've heard George talk about it, I'm not clear about how he's thinking about top-down causation. So if I was following you rightly before, you were saying, well, if the fundamental laws of physics were deterministic, there'd be no room for top-down causation. But because they're probabilistic, there is room for top-down
Yep.
causation. Okay, so suppose now, just keep things really simple and make toy physics. Suppose that there are particles and fields, and there's a state of the particles and the fields, and that the laws are probabilistic. So the laws say something like, when you got this kind of state, these are the probabilities of various evolutions. You get probabilistic laws. Of course, as things get evolved, you may get complicated structures, just depending on what the fields and the particles are.
Yeah.
So maybe you get a mathematician at some point. And now it seems as though you want it to be the case that this mathematician moves his body in some way such that the probabilities of his moving this way or that way are being trumped by the fact that he's thinking about mathematics.
Well, for instance, yeah.
Yeah. So these probabilities then are probabilities that aren't fundamental probabilities given the state.
Yeah.
They are probabilities that can be trumped
Yeah.
by higher level.
Yeah. Yeah. The key thing there, I've been more and more understanding the power of adaptive selection. I mentioned this already. Now, the key point about this, in order this to work, it's crucial that our bodies are made up of these huge numbers of cells. 10 to the 13 cells make up our body. There's a huge amount of random stuff going on at the micro level in biology. For instance, across the synaptic gap, stuff diffuses across. It's a random kind of process. The key thing is that because things are happening randomly, you can select things by a process of top-down causation, because adaptive selection is a top-down process. And the process of adaptive selection is you've got a whole ensemble of stuff coming in, and you select the stuff you want to go through and you reject the stuff that you don't want to go through. And by that way, you create order. All of the information that you wanted was there, but it was messed up in a whole lot of other stuff, and you create order by selecting that stuff that you do want, and you let that through, and you don't let the other stuff through. And adaptive selection creates order out of it. What you need in order that to happen is this ensemble of stuff which is kind of random, and you can create the order out of that by a process of selection, which is a top-down process.
Quite literally then, imagine from a God's eye point of view,
Yeah.
here's the state. Maybe we can't do the calculations.
Yeah. No,
God can do the calculations.
Yeah.
The state gives the probabilities of various evolutions,
Yeah.
but you're saying, well, the physics which entails those probabilities, is actually wrong.
No, let's take the simple case is Maxwell's demon, okay? You've got the molecules on this side and there's a trapdoor, and Maxwell's demon lets through only molecules whose speed is greater than 65 kilometers a second, okay? That's a process of adaptive selection which creates an order on this side which was not present on that side precisely because it adapts to say what makes it possible is because there was this whole random lot of stuff there from which you are able to choose a subset which obeys the principle that you want them to be the hotter molecules on this side and not those on the other side. And this process of adaptive selection is able to create order where there wasn't order precisely because there was a random lot of stuff out of which you could choose that which you wanted.
George, if I understand your point, sorry, I'm Bernard Carr. Cosmologist, yeah. If I understand the point you were making, it was that there are certain elements in the universe, meaning, morality, maths, which in some sense have to precede the universe itself. You know, that you're saying you cannot have morality emerging if it wasn't there to begin with, etc. Now, obviously that's a very interesting statement, but I want to ask you something else. It seems to me that if you're saying that, you also have to be saying in some sense that the other M, mind, must be preceding the universe, because of course all those things, morality, meaning, maths, are all aspects of mentality. And that seems a rather dangerous statement, because if you start saying that, mind preceded the universe, that seems to get one into a lot of trouble with, certainly physicists and maybe even philosophers. So are you actually, and you did make an intriguing reference to mental space.
Yeah.
So are you actually saying that mind, and I suppose consciousness in some sense, let's say mind, but consciousness is too complicated. Are you saying mind is also precedes the universe?
I'm not necessarily saying that, but that would be a reasonable deduction. The thing is that there has to be this possibility of meaning coming to existence, okay? And where does that possibility come from? That's the issue. And I think that possibility cannot come out of nothing. I think it has to come out of something of a similar status before. In fact, obviously people can have a different philosophical view, but that's the position which I take.
So is it that package of mind, mentality, meaning, morality, which is, is that what one would call God then?
Yeah, it's a package.
Yes.
Billy Grassi, Religious Studies. George, I've heard you give this talk many times. Always nice to hear it. There's sort of maybe two obvious questions or background questions. What's the status of sacred scripture in your understanding? Does it have any relevance at all? And furthermore, this kind of moral realism that you're arguing for, do you think it helps us actually solve some of the great moral debates today, like solve some of the great moral debates today, like euthanasia, abortion, the tax code, homosexuality? What traction does it have? The environment, whatever bioethics. What principles might you derive from it that would actually have traction in the world today?
The sacred scriptures thing, my view would be something like the following: that there are mathematicians who are much better at seeing mathematical reality than others, and there are people out there who are much better attuned to seeing what the moral reality is than others. And so basically, in a sense, that's what it would be, that there are people who are in tune with the mathematics, and there are people who in some sense through the way that they live, through the way that they think, are in tune with that moral kind of thing. And the sacred scriptures would come from those people who have spent their lives thinking about it. For instance, I'm very, very aware of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi both spent, like Jesus actually, 15 years thinking intensely, deeply about the way that they should act, the way that morality works and so on, before they started their actual campaigns of life. And so that's the kind of life which you need to live. There's some people who put their life energies into this, and they are likely to be more attuned with the way it is than those who don't. It's the same with mathematics, of course. What is the traction of this? The way that morality works out in practice is obviously all the time context dependent, and so you have to understand the context, you have to understand the forces at work as well as the values. The basic point, in a sense, is an absolutely crucial one, that the idea of kenosis embodies a set of values of respecting other people, of not torturing, not killing, a whole lot of stuff like that, which are guidelines for how to proceed. They're not hard and fast rules, because there are these paradoxes we're perfectly aware of. If you're a pacifist, you know you've come across all of those kinds of paradoxes people put at you. There's no simple answer to these things, but it gives you a set of values. And the key point before you set out on any moral road is, what are the values which you're embodying in it? And now this is what the evolutionary paradigm is simply not able to provide you with. It cannot provide you with a set of values, except the value that I had to talk about this a few days ago in South Africa with an evolutionary psychologist. He says that the value that underlies all of this is survival. That's what Darwinian evolution is about, and that's the origin of values. Well, it isn't the origin of any higher level values. That is absolutely not true.
Sorry, Tim Maudlin, philosopher. There's just a comment. The way morality has been coming into this discussion originally had to do with ultimate explanation of existence, and I guess we're focused quite a bit on physical existence. And there was a funny comment when you thought it was somehow incongruous that Dawkins believes that there's a difference between right and wrong. So I just want to report a view.
Yeah.
It's a Platonic view. It's a really Platonic view.
Whose view is?
It's my view.
Your view.
I believe in. I'm a Platonist about mathematics. I'm a Platonist about justice and the good, in exactly the way Plato was in the Euthyphro. That is, where he said, even if there were gods, they couldn't make anything good.
Okay.
Right? They don't create the good.
Yeah.
Right. I actually, but I don't think that necessarily means that has anything to do with the creation of the physical universe any more than mathematical reality, right? Mathematical reality didn't create the universe. No. I don't think moral reality created the universe either. And I think it's perfectly possible that the physical universe only has the unity of a heap. It looks awfully heapish, right? There's a whole lot of stuff out there that looks very random. You see these nice, beautiful shots of these asteroids, and they're just barren and sort of dead and with random-looking pockmarks on them. And there's a heck of a lot more of that out there than anything that looks terribly well organized. Yeah. I don't see anything. I just want to say I don't see any connection, fundamentally, certainly about realism, about morality, and the issues about principles would explain to us the existence of the physical world. And I at least don't want it to take someone to take for granted that if you think the world was not created for any purpose, which actually I don't think the world was created for any purpose, that means there's no such thing as morality or right and wrong or significance of people doing things. Those just don't follow.
Okay, I think that's a very interesting viewpoint. And firstly, I'm happy that you believe in a moral reality. It is perfectly possible, as you say, that exists independent of the other stuff. If you are looking for an explanation which is a unifying explanation, the viewpoint I've put is a more unifying explanation than the one you are putting. They're both perfectly viable. Mine is just a more unifying one.
Laurie.
Okay, I'm Laurie Paul. I'm also a philosopher. And can you hear me, George? Okay. So I wanted to ask again about the reductionism, because I'm not clear on what you take reductionism to be, and by extension, then what you think what your argument is against it. So I guess I'll just sort of say that, the reductionist thinks that tables and minds and agents exist, and also that they have causal powers. So given that...
The reductionist thinks they have causal powers.
Absolutely. So the reductionist thinks that there are these agents and these minds. It's just that they reduce to, shall we say, arrangements of particles or whatever you might want to take to be fundamentally physical. In other words, it's not eliminativism or epiphenomenalism. It's rather a dispute about whether or not we can adequately capture or explain the sort of nature of the object at a higher level without having to add in or inject some kind of level or ontological fluid somehow up there.
Well, I guess there's a lot of difference amongst them, because there certainly are a lot of people out there who do claim the higher levels are epiphenomenal. Daniel Dennett is a specific example.
Yes, I would be careful about reading off metaphysics from Daniel Dennett. That's just a suggestion. In a sense, what I'm doing is distinguishing between metaphysical or ontological reduction and explanatory reduction. So one can deny that there's any explanatory reduction, but along with thinking that there's actually ontological or metaphysical reduction, that minds are just arrangements of particles.
Okay, well, it may or may not be the answer you want, but from my viewpoint, the crucial issue that happens is the following. As you go up the hierarchy of complexity, some of the higher level variables can be obtained by coarse graining of lower level variables, okay? And those are the ones which are emergent and fit in with the reductionist picture. However, there are some higher level variables that are not explainable in terms of coarse graining of lower level variables. And those are the ones which are genuinely higher level ones. They are not based in some serious sense in lower level ones. Let's take a very simple example, the value of money. Why does a sheet of paper with printing on it have the power that you can turn it into meals and motor cars and all sorts of things? Money is an example of something which has its causal power because of mental activity. It clearly has that power. That's absolutely undeniable. You cannot explain the causal power of money in any reductionist way, I would claim.
So that's in a sense where I want to press you, because I understand that you claim that there's no way to reduce money, let's say, to particles, along with norms, which might also then reduce to particles, and mental states, which will also reduce to very complex arrangements of particles. Yeah. But the reductionist denies that, and so I just didn't hear any argument for why you thought reductionism was false. I see that you think it is.
Okay, well, the technical issue here is the following. You have top-down causation when you have an equivalence class of lower-level variables that all realize the same higher-level variable, and it doesn't matter which member of the lower-level class instantiates it. What the higher-level action does is select any one of the class, and it's the fact that it selects any one of the class which means it's the higher-level thing which is the causally afflictive variable rather than the lower-level ones.
Bill Summers.
Bill Summers, biologist. I think it's easy for me to understand how the square root of 2 being irrational is a concept that would be culture invariant, perhaps galaxy invariant, maybe universe invariant. It's a little harder for me to understand the kenosis as being how invariant and what is it a category that each culture or each universe would fill with its own rules, or I just don't understand how could we, if we are sending a spaceship out with a right triangle on it, we believe that everybody's going to understand that.
Yeah.
What would we do? Would the same sort of thing work with your canonic principles?
We're in a realm of speculation here. With this square root of 2, one will simply believe that the competent mathematicians had discovered it out there, and they're incompetent mathematicians if they don't discover it.
Because it has some truth in the universe.
Yeah. It is my belief that the power of kenosis is a universal psychological principle which will be realized in any beings that exist out there. I think Terence Deacon's example is a nice halfway example. Terence Deacon's example is that those language rules which Chomsky thought were inbuilt and so on. In fact, his belief is that they are discovered by people because the whole power of communication depends on your symbolic system representing reality in a sensible way. And that means that your symbolic system can't just be constructed in any arbitrary way. It has to correspond to reality. It has to have nouns and verbs and so on. And so, in fact, there are semiotic rules which will be discovered by any intelligent beings if they get to the stage that they're going to have language. And I believe it's the same with morality, that the people who are competent in moral issues will discover that the deep basis of morality is kenosis. Now, the evidence of that is that this does exist. The stream of kenotic understanding exists in all the major world religions, in what I would call the spiritual side of the world religion, not the fundamentalist side. All of the world religions have a fundamentalist side and a spiritual side. My claim will be that it exists in all of the major world religions on the spiritual side, and that gives me some confidence that the same thing would be discovered elsewhere. But it's also because it isn't just a religious principle. I said it's a social principle. It's a principle of learning. It's a principle which is needed in order that you can exist as a higher level being, able to respond to the world in a higher level way. That's my belief.
Priya, then Nancy.
So I want to understand whether you are differentiating morality from moral laws. So just as we have physical laws, are these laws on the same footing that pre-exist, and then there are various instantiations of these moral laws that could be culture dependent, universe dependent? Are you allowing for that, or am I?
I don't believe in any set of laws like the ones written on the tablet that were brought down. In fact, from my Quaker position, which my colleague Billy there agrees to some extent, the problem is any attempt to write down in words laws like that will always be a failure. It's bound to not succeed. The harder you would try to write down meaning or moral laws in words, the more you're going to fail, because they will never ever succeed. There was that story about the rules of Oxford University in which it said, I can't remember the details, but something, you will not, I can't remember you will not take the proctor's motor car and put it in the river Oxford or something like that. Any rules you set down will never cover all possibilities or all contexts and so on. So you've got to have a spirit behind it rather than a set of rules.
So I guess the thing that I find slightly problematic is the fact that values and morals, I mean, you have a conception that there's a universality to them.
Yeah.
And how does that segue with sort of real notions of tolerating differences between people?
Notions of?
Tolerating differences between people, cultures. There's a tension there, right? There are a set of universally agreed upon moral principles. It's a small set. I mean, lots of variants are derived from that.
Well,
there's an essential set, right?
Yeah, it's useful, I think, to think of the range of moral behaviors stretching. Over on this side is coercion. I'm going to torture you and kill you if you don't do what I want. A little bit further along, I'm not going to torture or kill you, but I'm going to avoid you as far as I can. Over here, there's getting to yes. We can get together and we don't have to like each other, but we can make things work. Over here, as we move along, is forgiveness. I will forgive you even if you harm me. Over here is the real kenosis as practiced by Gandhi and Martin Luther King, where I am willing to suffer on your behalf voluntarily and freely. And that's the true thing. That is the deep thing which has the chance to transform things. that implies all of that stuff about being willing to live in your shoes, to respect you, and all the rest of it there.
The whole continuum exists, or only that?
No, the whole continuum exists. And in fact, the history of humanity has been that the morally advanced people have been moving. In fact, the public understanding, not practice, but the public understanding has been shifting along in a quite extraordinary way, which people don't always realize. Just as a specific example, you no longer find people being burnt to death in the streets of Oxford because they don't subscribe to some specific religion. You no longer find people being hung, drawn, and quartered in the streets of London and so on. Things have moved an incredible amount over the past 150 years. You no longer get public executions in the streets of Stellenbosch, which you got 100 years ago. Things have moved an incredible amount, not because morality has changed, it's because our public understanding of morality has changed.
I guess Pinker is making a similar case in his new book on violence. Not on the same basis, however.
Yeah.
Nancy and then Kit.
Hi, Nancy Abrams. I'm a lawyer and an author. George, there was an interesting experiment done where a group of people was given a hypothetical situation where by killing one person, they could save the lives of 5 people.
Yeah.
And so it turns out that the great majority of people will do that as long as they can kill the person by pulling a switch. But if, in fact, they have to kill the person with their bare hands, no one will do it. And it turns out that the reason is that there's actually a biological repulsion. There's something going on in the brain that does not permit us to do that. Now, which group of people had discovered the morality that was implicit in the beginning of the universe? The ones who killed the one to save the 5, or the ones whose biology prevented them from doing that?
I don't believe biology prevents you from doing that. There are a great many people out there who are perfectly happy to stick a knife into you. I simply don't believe biology prevents you.
Well, of course there are people who will kill, but they are extremely rare.
No, they're not.
The great majority of people, there are... You're saying the great majority of people will not kill with their bare hands.
How is it?
If you look at war today, the same thing is true. We kill in great numbers only at a distance. If people had to kill with their bare hands, we would not be able to have the wars that we have today.
Well, 150 years ago, everybody was killed by their bare hands. People were perfectly happy to do it. Yeah. Yeah.
And hunger. If you had hunger, you didn't get water.
40% casualties in a single
Yeah,
battle.
but in any, but I have great skepticism about those experiments. I know about those experiments. I think this one where you're standing on the railway track and you're supposed to say, I think that's an absolute nonsense experiment. It's an intellectual exercise that's got nothing to do with real values. It's a totally unreal situation, got nothing to do with real life. I'll just say a word of that. I've actually had a PhD student in psychology who did a study on guilt. In contrast with those experiments, what we got the student to do was very interesting. She had an experiment where she was trying to find out the neural correlates of guilt. Okay, and what she did was she brought these people in and she asked them various questions. She put them up, and then they were being paid some money for the experiment that they did, and she went out, the experiment went out, and the associate, who was the assistant in the experiment, said to the people who'd been brought in, you're behaving so well, I'm going to give you some extra money, okay? And then the experimenter came back and found there was some money missing, and she said to this associate, there's money missing, what happened? She said, well, I gave them some money because they were behaving so well. And she said, well, you can't do that, I'm firing you. At which the spike of guilt in these people went up like that. We had an experiment in which we genuinely evinced guilt. I don't believe for one moment that experiment you're talking about evinced any real moral issue.
You would prefer they actually carried the experiment out to see...
You have to have a situation which is a realistic situation where it really looks like the thing is actually happening.
The point point is that there's actually something going on in the brain that prevents us from acting in ways which intellectually we actually would like to act in because we think they're moral. But there are biological limits to what we can do. Are you denying the biological limits? I guess
Yes, I'm denying the biological limits. If you live on the Cape Flats, people are happy to stick a knife into you anytime, any place.
Yeah, fine, I'm a philosopher. I only asked one question, which is about the infinite. So you talked about the space of possibilities for thought, and you thought that since our minds are finite, that space should itself be finite. Now, one place where people talk about the space of possibilities is in syntax.
Yeah.
So many linguists assume that we have, even though our minds are finite, we have the ability in principle to recognize as grammatical an infinite number of sentences. So the boy saw the girl who liked the man who blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And so you might think that in principle, even though no one could ever actually produce these sentences, we have the ability to recognize an infinitude of different sentences as grammatical. Now, one thing that linguists or formal people, at least the people who deal with the more formal side of things, consider is what kind of grammar we might be working with. Is it context-free grammar or some kind of context-sensitive grammar or minimal grammar in the sense of Chomsky or what have you? Okay. Now, so a grammar is meant to generate a set of grammatical strings. That's the job of a grammar. Okay. If that set of strings was finite, this exercise would make no sense at all, because any kind of grammar, whatever, can generate any finite set of strings. So for one of the most basic questions in linguistics to make any sense at all, you have to assume that the set of strings generated, that is the set of expressions that we have the ability to recognize as grammatical, is infinite.
Okay, well, my response is I think linguists have forgotten what language is about. Language is about communication. By the time you finish a sentence, you must remember what it was at the beginning of the sentence. And if you can't do that, that sentence will not convey information. So the point about a language is it's to convey information from you to me. Now, in fact, I wrote a little paper about this, which I couldn't get published, but you can easily sit down and work out, amongst the things that limits the length of a sentence is the time a person exists. And we did a little calculation. Supposing the day you're born, you start writing letters and you write them day and night for every 10 letters every second. You do that for your entire life, and then you die at the age of 100. You can work out how long that sentence would be, and it's not infinite, it's finite. Okay? And so what linguists have forgotten is that sentences are to do with conveying meaning between people who actually exist. The same problem is true with the Turing machine. The Turing machine talks about an infinite tape, but actually any computer has a finite life. It won't last longer than 14 billion years, and so the amount of stuff that a computer tape can read is actually finite. And people need to remember the actual real context in which language exists. And in the real context, every sentences that are meaningful are finite. In fact, I'll give you an estimate of how long a meaningful sentence is. It's 49 words long for the simple reason as follows. Short-term memory can hold 7 things, so you can have 7 phrases of 7 letters. Any sentence longer than 49 words is pretty difficult to understand. So let's be generous. Let's say 490. I don't believe a meaningful sentence can be longer than 490 words.
One quick response, which is the sentence, John likes Mary very, 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 very. You can go on as long as you like. And then you end with much. But my question was, how to do grammatical, there are many aspects of meaning, you're quite right. This question has to do with grammatical competence. In what does our grammatical competence consist?
Yeah.
Okay, and suppose that it might consist in our working with a certain kind of grammar.
Yeah.
Okay, and we learn and then we learn what the particular instance of what that grammar might be from your exposure to.
Yeah.
But the whole problem now of modeling that competence, as being competent in one kind of grammar rather than another, as I say, presupposes that the grammar is going to generate an infinite number of sentences. So we can't even make sense of that very basic question in linguistics unless we presuppose
You can't make sense of what question?
what kind of, whether we're working, let's say, with a context-free grammar or some kind of context-sensitive grammar or what have you, many different kinds of grammar on the market. The question, what we're trying to do is model our grammatical competence,
Yeah.
our ability to distinguish grammatical from ungrammatical sentences.
Yeah.
If that ability simply consisted in the ability to distinguish a finite number of strings, we would not be able to ask the questions of the sort that we do about whether we're working with a context-free grammar or what have you. So the whole theoretical enterprise, actually, again, another thing has to do with, so, I mean, this is so-called complexity theory. When people think, how hard is it to solve a problem? Okay.
Yeah.
Unless the problem were infinite in nature, that is, there are an infinite number of answers, at least the standard way of approaching those questions of complexity couldn't be raised. So there's a lot of theoretical inquiry that just presupposes that we're working with these infinite structures.
Well, I think there's a problem with those with that approach. In terms of linguistics, I'm not an expert on it, but I have been told by my linguistic colleagues that the way that one should go is linguistic corpora, the approach of Michael Hoey, in which you talk about the way that words occur in collocations with each other, and that in fact the real way to do it is not to go a rule-based approach, because I don't believe the mind works in a rule-based way when we construct sentences. I believe it rather works on the basis of the collocations that Michael Hoey has written about.
Kant had written.
Nobody understood. Evan.
Evan Morse. I'm a philosopher of religion. I wanted to ask you to talk a little about what you take the difference between science and philosophy to do, which I think might sort of ground how we're thinking about the question.
The difference between science and philosophy.
Yeah, you made a big deal about this distinction that you were going to speak as a philosopher and not as a scientist. And I think that since we're talking about kinds of explanation and how different levels of explanation relate to each other, you might talk a little more about that, because very quickly it seems like in talking about your ideas on kenosis, about moral facts and about meaning, we've dismissed certain accounts of how that might have arisen. So sociobiological accounts, which attempt to give some account of how those moral facts might have arisen, were dismissed as not being adequate to the reality of meaning or moral facts in the world. So how do you see that as different?
I think they're adequate for low-level morality, but not for deep morality.
So are you saying that there's something unscientific about talking about deep morality and trying to give explanatory accounts for how deep morality might have arisen? That it's somehow philosophical and not scientific? And is there some general account of what differentiates scientific from philosophical explanation?
Well, the problem is the very science deals with stuff which is strictly repeatable. It's strictly repeatable because you restrict the circumstances in a laboratory so that only one or two variables are varying, and it's in that context that you can do repeatable science. You get your laws which are repeatable laws. You can't do that kind of thing in the world of morality. It's not possible. And so it's you can use scientific kinds of thinking. You can use you're certainly doing evidence-based stuff. You're looking for general rules. You're looking for generalizations and all the rest of it. But you cannot obtain the kind of experiments which will prove it to be true that you can in the case of a scientific experiment. So you can use the same kind of approach, but you can't get the same kind of proof.
I want to get Dennis, and then Julian has
Dennis Turner, sort of bogus theologian. I'm not a Platonist, and I'm feeling a bit crushed out of the conversation by the sort of background Platonism that seems to be going on here. But I am a moral objectivist, and I don't think the universe of this particular discussion is occupied by Plato on the one hand and Dawkins on the other. There are plenty of spaces in between the two. And I'm not quite sure what the route is out of the dilemma which is getting posed between Plato and Dawkins. But it just occurs to me that if I saw a man walking down the street, amusing himself by kicking a paper bag. And then I saw another man walking down the street, amusing himself in the same sort of way, but this time kicking a baby. And I said to him, don't you see a difference between kicking a paper bag down the street as a matter of amusement and kicking a baby down the street as a matter of amusement? He said, no. Kicking babies down the street is more amusing than kicking a paper bag down the street. Makes more noise, much more fun, much more sort of reaction, etc. I think what I would do is lock him up as a psychopath. I don't think that there's some sort of eternal verity that he's failed to understand. He just doesn't understand what it is to be a human being. And that seems perfectly consistent with an evolutionary account of how come we are the sorts of beings who can think like that. So the mistake, it seems to me, is to suppose, and I think this is Dawkins' mistake, is that a genetic account of how come we are the sorts of beings we are entails a certain kind of morality, namely that which, as it were, makes a rational activity out of the description of the process which got us there. So it seems to me there's plenty of space for a middle way between Platonism on the one hand and Dawkins on the other, and I just simply wanted to advertise that space, that's all. I'm not quite sure how I'll best occupy it.
Okay, I want to make one comment about what I call the fallacy of evolutionary origins. Now, you can explain certain amount of the way people behave, what they think is moral behavior in evolutionary terms. That's totally irrelevant to whether that is in fact moral or not. And the point about it is the following. Because evolutionary theory evolutionary psychology underlies all the way the mind works, there's an evolutionary psychology explanation for everything. For instance, theoretical physics. There has to be an evolutionary psychology explanation for theoretical physics. There has to be one for evolutionary psychology itself. The fact that you've got an evolutionary psychology explanation for belief, there's also an evolutionary psychology explanation for all of the other things, which astrology. Okay, the fact there's an evolutionary psychology explanation has nothing to say about whether it is a true or a false theory that you've got. It's got absolutely irrelevant. And so the fact that there's an evolutionary explanation for every single thing that we do, and it doesn't have nothing to say about whether your theory that you derive is a correct theory or a false theory.
Just very quickly, I mean, it seems to me in that connection obvious and rather interesting that it's taken very nearly 13.7 billion years for the state of affairs to evolve in which there are people who know that the universe has existed for 13.7 billion years. It's neither here nor there that it's taken that long as to whether it's true or false.
Exactly,
Julian. Julian Barber, theoretical physicist. Could you clarify a little bit more, George, what you're saying about you can't apply scientific methods to unique objects like the universe? Herman Bondi said something a bit like that, and I'm not sure that I agree at all, so I wonder if before I try and put my point, you could just make your position clear.
Well, there's 2 points about it. It's the whole concept of a scientific law, by its very definition, because it's a law, it applies to a lot of different cases, and you get different outcomes depending on what initial conditions you had or something like that. If you have only one instance of a thing, what sense does it make to say you've got a law? Because you've got one thing, all you can do is describe it. But the second point is, if there was a law for the creation of the universe, there's no way you can find out what that law is, because you can't rerun the test. You can guess what it is, but there's absolutely no way that you can prove there is a law by which the universe came into existence. And the attempts people have made to talk about laws of creation of the universe are by using laws which apply within the universe once it has come into existence. It's not at all the same thing as talking about how the universe came into existence.
Well, first of all, I'll say something about this tomorrow, because I think things are completely different when you can get it out of your head that time exists, George. Your specific case now, you're referring to initial conditions, because, for example, if I take an island universe of point particles described by Newton's laws, I can perfectly well establish that it is satisfying the Euler-Lagrange equations in a unique solution. I wouldn't have a theory for why it was that particular solution, but I would be able to say that this one unique object is satisfying a very definite law. It is minimizing a rather simple variational principle.
Oh, once it's come into existence, it behaves laws which we know and understand.
I was wanting to get your position clear. You're arguing about the initial conditions.
Well, about how it actually gets created.
Yes. Well, I'll give you the answer tomorrow.
Don Mender, psychiatry. I'm going to ask a non-psychiatric question related to George, to your statements about top-down selection and probability. Are you talking about only classical probabilities? If you're not, if you're talking also about quantum superpositional probabilities, how does the selection work top down? I would.
No, I'm talking about classical probabilities.
Classical.
Yeah.
So you don't see any role for quantum probability in that statement?
I'm not ruling it out. It's just I don't understand enough about it to comment on that. So there's one other very important thing I want to say about top-down causation, because I could say a lot more, but one of the crucial things about top-down causation is that top-down causation can change the nature of the entities which are interacting with each other. Now that's very crucial. For instance, in a human body, you start off with cells which are pluripotent, and then top-down causation changes them, some into neurons, some into blood cells. And so the nature of the entities which make up the higher level thing are changed by top-down action through the process of developmental biology. And the same is true in many cases in society. Human beings are changed by the society in which they exist. For instance, they learn to speak Chinese or French or Russian or whatever, depending on the societies in which they exist. So one of the very important ways top-down causation works is it changes the natures of the entities which are making up the higher level entity. And that means that things are very, very different than a billiard ball situation when the billiard balls are unaffected by the context in which they live.
Can I just ask one more question, and this is to everybody. The issue, but I guess specifically to George, and it's on another subject, the ideas of Kant in terms of morality, the thing in itself, and the universality of moral principles. That's kind of different, I think, than the Platonic viewpoint. I'm wondering if anyone can comment on potential relevance there.
So Kant does think that morality is universal. In the sense that it follows the categorical imperative which requires me to will the maximum of my action as a universal law. However, that's perfectly consistent with it being objective in the sense that Dennis was talking about, rather than real in a Platonic way. So Kant doesn't require, in order to have his kind of universality, that there be these value properties existing independently of any of us endorsing them.
Yes. Dr. Ellis, I enjoyed your talk. Turn on the mic, please. Pradeep Mutalik. I'm in medical informatics, but I like to consider myself a freelance scientist. I really enjoyed your talk. I enjoyed both the first part and the second part, but I thought they had absolutely nothing to do with each other. And there are three things that make me believe this. The first is that I'm not a Platonist, but assuming that that there are Platonic truths, the thing is that these truths will have nothing to do with a specific universe. They have to do with the possibility of all possible universes. And therefore, there is nothing in there that is specific to any given universe. So, for example, the laws of logic are Platonic. And we tend to forget that mathematics is just like logic. You have to have premises, and from that, the rest, whatever conclusions are, follows. For example, discrete mathematics assumes that there are discrete entities that you can count, and from that all integers and everything follows. Continuous mathematics implies that there are entities that you can measure in a continuous form with infinite numbers of points. But in a universe where there are only discrete, there's no such thing as discrete objects. For example, you can imagine a universe which has bubbles which kind of melt together. So in that universe, the discrete mathematics will not work. So mathematics does not have universal truth. There has to be some kind of assumption or premise that's made, and only then the rest of. So Mandelbrot set does not exist if the assumptions of continuity are not made first. So that's the first point. The second point is that that I agree that there is top-down causation, but it's always in the positive time direction. And you showed a hierarchy of the biological hierarchy, where you had elementary particles and atoms and so on, and then you go to beings like I guess animals and so on. And there was a time in the universe when atoms did not exist. So at that point there was no chemistry and there was no top-down effect of chemistry. And so purpose and mind only exist once the hierarchy has gone to a level where animals can exist. There was no purpose before the first animal existed. And therefore, you cannot have purpose as an antecedent to the universe. And and the third point is that I take very strong. I think that your point about kenosis is well taken, and it's the greatest moral value. But I take strong exception to the idea that it cannot be explained by evolution. The way it can be explained is this: that you have evolution has endowed us with love. It has endowed mothers with love for their children, and so whenever evolution creates something like this, it is created as a separate module, if you will, in the mind. So there is a point of view where you can express this love. And evolution has also created reason, which enables you to take some phenomenon and generalize it. So now you have this module of love and you have this module of reason. And reason is like an escalator. Once you start it, you have to follow it, wherever it goes. So if you take, for example, Peter Singer's idea of the expanding circle, we all of us have love. We have the module of love which evolution has put in us. We all have reason. And when we take this idea that this love applies not just to the people who are close to us, we realize that that all human beings basically are very similar to each other, and we just take reason and we apply it to everybody. Then the idea of kenosis and all the deep moral values automatically emerge. So I don't think that there is anything mystical about them or anything that that cannot arise from biology.
I simply don't believe that morality derives from reason. I think morality is. Furthermore, I don't think that if you're assuming that if you can explain, you're making the logical fallacy. You believe that people behave in a logical fashion, a rational fashion. They don't. That's.
Yes, but nobody follows these deep values. Very few people do. So only a few people realize these values, and those are the people who are applied reason to their, who realize that every human being has to be treated equally. So they are using reason.
Could I just say a very quick word about that? Peter Singer's view is that reason allows you to get off the escalator at any point. Reason doesn't require you to go up to the top.
I wanted to return to a question that Bernard Carr raised, that I think was largely suggested by some of the things that George said, and that has to do with the relationship between the laws that may pre-exist the universe and the universe itself. And this is the question of dualism versus some kind of unitary picture. So the
dualism
idea
versus?
the question is, we've been mentioning Plato's name a lot. So Plato, of course, emphasized the distinction between the forms and the mere reality, the reflection, the shadows on the cave wall, in his analogy from the Republic. So he had both a separation between the forms, the mathematical truths, etc., on the one hand, and mere physical reality on the other. And there was also, of course, a hierarchy. The forms were eternal and essential and so forth. But the problem is the connection between the two. That's the mind-body problem. When one associates spirit or mind with the forms. And I wanted to raise that explicitly. Obviously, we won't finish the discussion, but since this is a discussion involving theologians, philosophers, and scientists, and that question seems to underlie a fair amount of the discussion, I wanted to bring the dualism question out explicitly and ask, are you a dualist? And if so, that is, if you think that there are fundamentally two different kinds of things, the forms or the laws or whatever they are, and the physical universe, what exactly is the connection between them? If you think that the universe embodies those laws, well then you're not a Platonist because you're not a dualist. You're actually reifying the laws, and you're saying that the laws are actually the way the universe works. And that's my personal view as a theoretical physicist. I don't think we necessarily have the laws, but it's a sort of article of faith that there are such laws, and that if we try very hard, we'll at least come closer and closer to them. But I just wanted to bring up this question of the connection. The question is also raised in a somewhat different language, and another quotation from Brief History of Time, besides the ones that have been made so far, and that is, what breathes life into the equations?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I don't think I can answer your question adequately except to say that I do believe in the laws of physics myself in the same sense that you do. Yeah.
Yes, and then one more after this.
Okay. Graziella Zinn, I'm an astronomer and I'm involved in social justice and peace ministry. In my ministry, I started from the principle, if you want to peace, work for justice. Justice is based on the common good, and the common good is based on the respect of all the human rights for each person that come from natural law. Some people would like to pick and choose the respect of human rights. I find that one way to make them thinking is to talk about the golden rule, present in all religions. Don't do to others what you would like not done to you. George, do you see a correlation between kenosis and golden rule?
Oh yes, except the kenosis is deeper than the golden rule. The golden rule is a shallow version of kenosis, from my viewpoint. But I do want to make a point, though, that there are many people who do not accept the golden rule, and one has to remember that.
Oh, too bad.
Last question for Julian.
This is actually a comment really from the evolution can explain love. Evolution can behave perhaps the behavior of love, but we have mentioned qualia once or twice. I absolutely don't believe the theory of evolution can explain the sensation of love, the experience of love.
That was not a question, but let's thank all of our speakers. And then dinner is at here, upstairs, not here, but upstairs at 6 p.m. And we're on a break now until 6 p.m.
Phew, thank you.
You weren't saying that Maxwell's demon creates order, were
Yeah. What's going on with these guys? Yeah. And they're
Delia, the demon, let's call her, is pumping order out of herself.
the thing is that we want
She's pumping order out of herself into
link
one
on the web page for tomorrow.
It should have been on.
one of the containers, right?
Yeah, but, well, how
Sure.
We don't get these.
is one issue, but nevertheless, it is going against the stream of entropy.
If you take just the two containers of gas,
Is it going so bad? How?
gas plus the demon, then the
Now it has to be. Oh, we should have asked Michael to
is increasing.
Yes, that's right. But
do it before dinner. Maybe announce.
Yes. Okay. As long as
Announce maybe
okay, I
that
just wanted
these
to make sure
permission
that was
really be handed in as soon
right.
as
That is right.
everybody. All speakers, everybody actually, because they're all being filmed. Their heads are being filmed.
Isn't anything biological?
Get one myself.
Maxwell's
The package? Oh, okay.
We're local, high concentrations.
Yeah.
But only got by
The work
getting
is that we have
at
pause.
the cost of greater disorder.
You don't get to eat your sweet white with
But
us.
yeah, I think without life, the general tendency of the universe would be increase. It's in either case, it's going to be increasing disorder. But without life, with no local concentration, high concentration, or at least a lot fewer of them.
Long, Dennis. I mean, and the thing is, it's written beautifully.
I can't think of anything but life. What else but life creates high local concentrations of order?
Exactly.
machines can do it.
Oh yeah, but of course only if they have to be created by life.
For instance, of the chemical industry.
There's a
which is
form on the back, so I'll get you one.
But then the distal cause of that is still life. Operating through some intermediate cause.
No, but I think.
To go to jail as a result.
Yeah.
Just say slides in my car.
Yeah, just a statement.
Only by arranging pieces of stuff in a way that they wouldn't be arranged
I think as long as you list the names.
without the biology.
Correct.
Yeah. So yeah, same thing, different words.
To give the names of people, right? Or should you give the name of slides? I think don't worry about it, but.
Right, and they downloaded it from somewhere
Where else?
It's to commons.
Yeah, this is James's Barnett.